We're going to talk about nickel plating and electroplating, but nickel plating specifically. So I brought like kind of a setup that I use. Of course, I didn't bring any of the chemicals, but it's going to be kind of set up in a really similar way to the way it would look in the shop. I brought samples of the progression of a process, and then I brought samples of crappy plating and good plating. So I guess we'll start by why did I come to be someone that could nickel plate something? Well, 15 years ago I bought a 1927 Indian Scout, and then of course I didn't know anything about Indian Scouts. I didn't know anything about 20s motorcycles. I just wanted something old. Come to find out, every single thing on an Indian Scout is pretty much nickel plated. And so then I started doing research like, well, what does it mean to like get all this stuff nickel plated? Well, it means a lot of money. It means that you are taking your stuff to somebody else, you're entrusting that they treat it in a nice manner, you're entrusting that they don't lose it, and you're entrusting that they plate it in the way that you want it. So there's a lot of variables in taking your rare stuff or stuff that takes huge amounts of time and effort to plate or to fabricate. So I just thought, well, number one, I'm on the broke side, and number two, I'm a major control freak. So I said, I'm going to try to do this myself. What does it take? So I started doing some research, and there's a company back in upstate New York that sells all kinds of plating supplies. It's home plating stuff. Now, that being said, home plating isn't necessarily like what you would get from an industrial plater that plates out in the world. I mean, there are going to be some differences between what I do and what Detroit or industrial plating in Omaha does. They've got way more, how would I say it? They've got better power supplies, they've got acid baths that get rid of rust and contaminants a lot better than I do. So, you know, really what I'd say as far as a restorer goes, this is a really good supplement to getting plating done. Large items I can't do. I plate in a 5-gallon bucket, right? So I'm not plating big, huge, long things. I'm not plating bumpers. I'm not plating whole gas tanks, right? So things like that, I'm going to have to trust somebody else. Barrels, something that I also, I just don't have enough power in my power source to have enough current to plate a barrel. So there's some things that I trust the platers to. Other things I just decided to do myself. Okay, so that's my story on how I got going on this. Now let's just do a real quick talk about exactly what electroplating is. So let's start in 1799. There was an Italian physicist who came up with the Voltus, what is it called? The Voltus pile, which that's a fancy name for battery. Okay, so it was the very first battery that could give you a continuous DC power source. So once that was in place, now people started doing all kinds of experiments with it. 6 years later, in Italy, a guy comes up with electroplating using one of these batteries. The first thing that he plated were 2 silver medallions, and he plated them with gold plate. At that point, he was working in France, and Napoleon said, "This is secret now. We're not going to let anybody know about it." So all research stopped on the whole nickel plating thing, or with the plating with the guy in France. Fast forward another 20, 30 years, people in London, or not London specifically, Birmingham, England, they started to mess around with plating. And it really was about like the Industrial Revolution. They started making large amounts of items that needed to have corrosion resistance. So things like forks, spoons, knives, tableware, things like that started getting plated with silver plate. Well, at some point, silver is expensive, right? So they needed another metal that was cheaper and that had a very similar look. And they came up with metal, or with nickel. So the good thing about nickel is it doesn't tarnish like silver. and it's much cheaper. And so they started plating all of this stuff in the 1840s with one of the very first generators that was produced in England, a DC generator. Okay, so then throughout the 1800s, there had been some increases in the electrolyte, which is the bath of soluble salts that the parts hang in. There have been a lot of advancements in making that electrolyte better. By 1915, they really had nailed a guy by the name of Watts, I think in Boston, I believe New England, some area. He came up with a revised bath that is really the blueprint for modern nickel plating. So that's kind of like the timeline of what happened with plating. So let's just get into the anatomy of the cell. Okay, so first off, we need to have a power source because we are using electricity to do this. So this is a DC power source. It plugs into the wall. It creates DC power up to 25 volts. What's that?
An electric train transformer.
Basically, yes. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to see here, there's going to be this tank bar. This tank bar is what the part hangs off of, which would be like, let's say this piece. This is a pedal side for the J model Harley, right? So it hangs off of here on a copper wire, and it hangs in. This is referred to as the cathode. Now, how do we get the nickel? These little sheets of nickel are what's referred to as the anode. Okay? So it just so happens that electricity flows in a particular way. So the cathode, which is the part, is hooked up to the negative terminal, and the anode, which is the metal that we are going to move from the metal to the part, that is positive. So electricity flows DC anyways, flows positive to negative. Am I right about that, electrical people? What's that?
Negative to positive.
Conventional, it was positive and negative for years, and then they discovered the charges on the electron. So in physics, it's negative and positive. For the rest of the world, we still do conventional, which is positive and negative.
Okay. All right. So there we are. That's the setup. Thank you for that. That's the setup. So that's really the anatomy of the tank itself. Now, this is a tiny 5-gallon bucket thing. If we go to a big plating shop, I mean, the baths are massive. It's the same idea. It's just way bigger, way more power, a lot more bath, all of that stuff, right? So the other part of the anatomy of the nickel plating tank I have here is I have a tank heater. So this plating needs to happen around 120 degrees Fahrenheit or so. So this tank heater heats that up. The other thing I have in here is a way to move, to have some water movement, or I shouldn't say water, the movement of the bath, circulation, to keep air bubbles and things from forming on the surface of the plating. Okay, so this thing's running, this thing is going, and also notice that my anodes, I've got 4 of them, and they are distributed all the way through the tank. If I had an anode just on one side, and then I had a piece hanging in the tank, because the anode is on this side of the cathode, I would get a lot thicker plate on this side of the part. So I need to put anodes all the way around so I get an even plate around it. Okay, so that's why I have all of my anodes connected together in a series of jumper wires. Okay, all right. So let's see. That's the setup. Now then, let's talk about all this stuff here. So the first thing you've got to deal with is that you've got a part that needs to be restored. Let's say we start with something that's really rusty, and it needs to get plated. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to get rid of the rust, right? There's multiple ways to do that. We can sandblast, we can use a wire wheel, we can use chemical baths, we can use acid treatment. There's a lot of ways. I'm not really going to go into like all the different rust removing ways. That actually would be a pretty cool thing if somebody wanted to do that one. But I use a lot of sandblasting and wire wheeling. Some of the chemical processes I've used, there's a bunch of different rust removing products out on the market. They have all kinds of kooky names like Evaporust and Rust Bandit. They come up with all these kooky names for them. I don't exactly know what's in those baths or what's in those products, but they do a good job of removing rust, you know, if they're fresh. All right, so we get rid of rust. That's the first thing. Next thing we need to do is get rid of grease and oil. Okay, so the piece is derusted. Now I need to get rid of grease and oil, which brings me to a heated degreaser that I use. Some people, I know that some home platers don't use a heated degreaser tank. They just spray a degreaser on with a spray bottle and wipe it off, and it's fine. I just particularly use a heated degreaser, and it's a very powerful detergent. And when you get it hot, it just, as we know, when you wash things when it's hot, it just does a pretty good job, better job of breaking things down. So I run this just below a boil. So I'll clean a part up, put it in this tank, let it get up to temperature. The nice thing about heating it, and this also goes for parkerizing as well, and I learned this trick from Don Lipsky actually. If you preheat the part before it goes into the parkerizing tank, you don't lose temperature in the tank, right? So if you're preheating the part, you're not lowering the temperature of the plating bath. So it really helps to have a heated degreaser, I think. So you do a degreasing. Now we don't want to get anything into the plating bath, right? We want to keep it free of debris, free of foreign chemicals, all kinds of stuff. So before anything goes into the plating bath, it needs to go through a distilled water rinse, right? So here, now it goes to here, now it can go into the tank, okay? So now let's go to these other things that I've got sitting here. So I'm going to pass this around. This is a brand new, this is basically brand new hardware. So if you're missing hardware and you need to be nickel plated, this is like kind of an example of what you could do. So at the top here is a zinc plated 1/4x20 screw, hex bolt. And then I have removed the zinc, which the zinc stripper I use is a 1-to-1 mixture of muriatic acid and distilled water. So you just soak this in that muriatic acid, it strips the zinc off. Then you now have acid, you have a very acidic environment on your part. So then I put it into an acid neutralizing bath, which is 1 box of baking soda for a gallon of distilled water. Right, so now you neutralize the acid, you have a completely stripped part. I've had very good luck taking a totally stripped part, nothing else done to it. I can drop it right into this tank and it plates perfectly fine. However, these have marks on the top of the bolts. They didn't put these marks on the top of the bolts if you're dealing with a 1920s motorcycle. So the next thing you do is you remove the marks from it. There's a multitude of different ways to do that. Then it goes through the degreaser, rinse, and into there. So I'm going to hand this around. People can look at what those look like. Also, I just want to say about plating, there's a saying in plating, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have something that is pitted, something that's in really bad shape, it doesn't fix that. It doesn't make it nicer. It just coats the crap that's there. So I have a load of bad stuff here to look at. Yeah.
Plating shops, if you have pitted stuff, will plate first with copper.
Yes.
Fill that in.
So that is called strike copper. So what they'll do is they will put a coating of copper on everything, and it can fill up pits. That is the difference between me and a plating shop. They're going to do that setup. I don't have that setup. So when it comes to my parts, I make sure that they are perfect before they go in. Now that's not always possible. So here are some examples. This is a clutch spring off of a 101 Scout. This is the ring on a 101 Scout that holds the taillight lens in. This is the Magneto cable holder, and then this is the magneto and throttle cable holder on a 101 Scout. So these have all been plated, but notice they are very pitted. They look bad. So garbage in, garbage out. That's what I've got here. Okay? So pass these around. You can see what those things look like.
Aren't you afraid to buy my pocket too?
I'm not afraid of that. No, I'm not afraid of that.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so also, you know, as you get through this, you can decide if you are going to do something that is going to be a dull nickel finish or a bright nickel finish. And really the difference that I would say between those is how shiny it is. I know that there are people who call it gray nickel. There's a lot of debate as to what is a dull nickel finish. A lot of times it has to do with the chemistry of the tank. I mean, if I have something plated at Detroit, down on Truman, and I plate something in my shop, they could potentially look different. They might have a little brighter setup than me. They might not use brighteners, or they might use more brighteners. They might have a different chemistry in their tank. So that's another reason why somebody might want to go into nickel plating everything themselves, so every single thing on the bike matches. I know this is going down the rabbit hole super hard, but when you're a control freak and you want to get 100 points in judging, it just makes a difference, I think. You know, so if all of my plating looks exactly the same, I think it just adds to the general nice nature of the motorcycle, right? So I'm going to hand this around too, and you guys can look at the differences in finishes. Some of these bolts are dull nickel, and some of them are bright nickel. Super, super high polished like a mirror. It is exactly the same plating. It's just that one was polished and the other wasn't.
So
Which is
it
when
doesn't-
you're going to come in talking about polishing next time. Yeah.
So the length of time doesn't determine the brightness.
No, the length of the time, and I'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to pass some parts around and people can look. So this is basically the end of my Indian project. I had hundreds of nuts and bolts and screws and washers that I plated, and this was the end of it. So you can kind of see there's washers, cotter pins, lock washers, nuts, bolts, grease zerks, all kinds of stuff in that bin you can look at. Okay, so then let's go through the process, right? I want to start plating. So the first thing we have to do is start with the idea that all of these metals take different metals. So if it's zinc or copper or chromium, nickel, gold, silver, they all take different amounts of power to plate. So with nickel, what you need to do, or with plating in general, and some people don't do this. I'll say this, that there are people who do home plating. They just turn an amperage on, and whatever that amperage is, they just let it do what it does. I follow a plating manual where I learned this. So you have to figure out the surface area of the part, figure out how much actual surface area of metal is there, and then that will dictate how much amperage you dial in order to plate it correctly. And so what does that mean? If you give more electricity, you move more metal and you get thicker plates. If you have very low amperage, you move very small amounts of metal and you get really thin plate. Okay? If you have really cranked it up and you're using too much power, you get rough plate. It's like kind of rough. It just doesn't plate very well. So it does behoove you to do the math and figure out the surface area of your part before it goes in. So I did an example here. I'm not a chemistry person or a math person necessarily, but I did do an example here. So let's say I had a 3/8 diameter brake rod that was 10 inches long. Right? So you figure out the circumference of the brake rod. So that is pi d, right? So 3.124 multiplied by 3/8, which the decimal equivalence is 375, right? And then you multiply that by 10 because that's the length of the brake rod. That gives you 11.77 square inches. Okay, great. Who cares, right? Well, it just so happens that for every 16 square inches of metal that is of the cathode that's hanging in there, for every 16 square inches, you need to use 1 amp of power. So now I take that 11.7, divide it by 16, and it gives me 0.73 amps. Great, I did all this stuff. It's hanging in there on a piece of copper. I even have a piece of copper wire. This is what I use to wire parts with. Home Depot, copper wire, not copper plated wire. I get straight copper solid core wire. Really, really heavy pieces. I don't know if I have any in here. Oh yeah, right there. This is the ground wire out of a piece of Romex. Or you can strip the insulation off of Romex, off a solid core wire. This is what I use to hang things in the tank. People want to see this? Do I need to hand this around? Do we know what copper wire looks like?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, you talked about your 10-inch rod. You plate that by itself, or what happens if you mix different parts of it?
Okay, so that is like a point of contention with some people. I learned a lot of this from a guy in the Sedalia area who was he restored antique firearms, like 1860s, 1870s revolvers and stuff. And so I went to his place and I wanted to know about nickel plating, and he would only plate 1 piece at a time. And like, come on, this is going to take you forever. If you need to plate, literally, it could be 500 parts to plate a 1920s motorcycle. It's going to take you forever. So I'll stack as many on the bar as I can. So if I did three 10-inch brake rods that were the same size, I would multiply that 0.73 by 3, and that's how many amps you need. Right? So yes, you can put as many on as you can, but I would recommend that the parts don't touch one another. Yeah.
A friend of mine used to work at a chrome shop, and he used to give me these 5-gallon jugs that nickel came. So,
Okay.
so that's going to be different than what you're doing, right? I never saw the solution, but it's something you poured out of the jug.
I would not know what was in that. It could be an electrolyte. I don't know. I don't know that.
Is there a time factor?
Yes, okay, so they say for about, if you have your amperage dialed in right, if you did your calculations correct, and you are using the right amount of amps, and how I use the power source is I plug it in and flip it on, and I turn my voltage all the way up. The voltage is as much as it is just a set point, right? So then what you do is I adjust the current knob, which gives me the amps, okay? If you are doing it in the right range, and they say there's about a 10% plus or minus cushion. So if you get a little bit too much or a little bit too less, not a big deal, right? Now if it's 40, 50, 60% more power, you start to have problems. Or if it's way under, you start to have problems. So you line everything up, hit the power. About an hour of plating gives you about 1/1000th of an inch. So if it was a rod, you're adding 2/1000ths of an inch in diameter, which I actually did. I had an AJS where I bought a valve guide, and Jack Larson was doing a head job for me, a valve job, and he said, your valve guide's kind of sloppy in the head. If you could add some diameter to this valve guide, we could be in a lot better shape. So I stuck it in the plating tank and I just plated the shit out of it. I just let it go and go and go. And I put about 3/1000ths of an inch of diameter on that valve guide, and he was able to install it in the head, and it worked fine. So there is that too. Yeah.
What did it do to the hole inside the valve guide?
Well, he lapped it.
Oh.
The other good thing about, well, I shouldn't say the good thing, the characteristic of electroplating is that it doesn't love to go inside of tubes very well. If I was plating an oil line, like maybe 1/4 of an inch, you would see some plates starting to get into the tube, but virtually the whole interior of the tube wouldn't be wouldn't be plated. If you wanted to plate the inside of stuff, you need to use something called electroless nickel, which was invented in the late 40s and was used up in, like really perfected in the 50s and 60s. It's really hard to find people to do electroless plating. I know because I tried to have some barrels done that way. I couldn't find a single plater in this country that was willing to plate some JD barrels with electroless. So that's the problem. Okay. So about a thousandth of an inch per hour. You start to go past that, then you get too much, I think. Okay. So then let's talk about some pros and cons of this. So I went into it a little bit with the electroless idea, right? I brought this where is it at? This Power Plus head. This is a late teens. Is that right, Rob? Late teens-ish Power Plus, something like that. Anyway, Indian Power Plus. It's seen better days. But the reason why I brought this is because this is a really great example of some problems that electroplating could have if you're trying to plate certain items. So notice that there are deep cooling fins, right? These fins stick way out, and then there are wells deep down inside of this barrel. So what's going to happen as the anode is giving up its metal and trying to stick to the cathode, it's going to pick path of least resistance. It is going to build a lot thicker plate on the edges and on the interiors, just the closer, I guess the further away from the center of the fins, which means these super, super deep recesses down here, they may not get any plate at all. Or we're talking very thin plate. So as I was talking to somebody about old nickel-plated barrels from the 20s, it's not like Harley got these to plate any better than they would now, or Indian, or any of those companies that would nickel plate barrels at the time. Basically, those companies sold barrel paint. Pretty soon after they sold these motorcycles, these were rusty barrels. That's what they looked like. So you had to paint your barrel or live with rust, or keep it very oily. That's the other thing, right? If you keep the inside of all those wells oiled up really well, you can avoid some rust. So that's going to be one of the problems. That's one of the downsides to electroplating, especially on barrels, is that, I was talking to Rob before the meeting started. He says he's seen these beautiful restorations where everything is amazing, except they got these super rusty barrels. Because when you ride the bike, it burns the oil off. It creates, a bare piece of metal that can be rusted extremely easily, right? So it's just something that, I don't know, it's an inherent thing about a nickel-plated barrel. You kind of have to embrace it to a certain point, or you just keep it oiled, or don't ride it. I mean, those are kind of your options, right? So,
if you're having your bike judged and there's rust on that barrel, they'll mark it off.
did that happen to you?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. Well, so, I kind of look at it like, I bet you some of these bikes were starting to rust before they were even sold to owners. I mean, they rode on a train from Milwaukee or Springfield or wherever, and by the time it got to Los Angeles, California, it rode on an open train car possibly. And, I mean, they were probably rusting when they hit the showroom floors, right? So, I don't know. Okay, so what else? So this is an example of a little project. So these are brake clevises for a JD. Somebody reproduces these things, and it's just crazy that you wouldn't buy these. They're so cheap. But when you get them, the nickel plate doesn't match all your other nickel plate. It was like, I'm the person that wants it to match. So I elected to buy the Parkerized versions that weren't nickel plated, and I just sandblasted them, and then I nickel plated them. So that's kind of an example of like going kind of far down the rabbit hole a little bit, like I'm trying to make my plating match. So, stripping stuff off and putting new plate on so it matches the other stuff you plated is part of part of it. So I can pass this around if people want to see that. I have a carburetor here. This is a Schebler carburetor, 1928 Harley carburetor. This is all bronze. Doesn't look bronze. A lot of times when you see these old motorcycles, like if you see Linkert carburetors and Schebler carburetors, people think they were bronze. And the nickel plating wore off eventually. You know, that's why they look that way. But these were originally like this. So then, which brings me to what kind of metals can we plate? I can plate anything that's ferrous, right? So we're talking cast iron, regular steel, things like that. Those are easy. Non-ferrous metals like brass, bronze, copper, those plate really well. You can plate aluminum, but you need to put another coating on top of the aluminum. So I do not plate aluminum in my shop. You can plate stainless steel, but you also need to do something with stainless steel before you plate it. You can plate over something that's already been nickeled, but you need to do a secondary process before you plate it. So I'll talk about that. So in this line of stuff that you have, I have one that is straight sulfuric acid, battery acid. So you go to Napa or whoever sells straight battery acid, pour battery acid in here. So what stainless steel does, and nickel, it passivates, which means it creates a protective oxide layer. And it's probably like 50 atoms thick. I mean, we're talking thin, like something you can't see with the naked eye. However, that really thin oxide layer basically creates a resist between the parent metal and the metal you're trying to put onto it. So, if you dip those parts, stainless steel, in sulfuric acid, you very quickly etch off that passivated layer, right? So then very quickly, it's very highly acidic, right? So very quickly it goes into my acid neutralizer. Now I don't want my baking soda solution in my degreasing tank, so now it goes into my rinse tank. Now that goes into the degrease tank. Then the degrease tank goes into the rinse tank, then into the plating tank. The key is to not let that stainless steel hang out and reoxidize. You know, this to this to this, not a problem. This, hang out for 5 hours, may be a problem. I don't know how fast those oxide layers get produced, but that's a problem. I do know that Doug Rollert had an issue with this. He had a 23 Henderson Deluxe. It was an astoundingly beautiful motorcycle, and he had to make all of his own fasteners. And he decided he was going to make his own front axle and axle nuts out of stainless steel. Sent them to the plater, came back from the plater, all the plating started falling off. It was because he didn't tell the plater it was stainless steel. They just thought it was polished steel, right? So there was a section that the plater probably should have etched that off, but that's the other thing. When you take things to a plater, you got to give them as much information about what you are having plated, so they do it right? Just, oh, this is stainless steel. Oh, okay, we know that we need to do this if we have stainless steel, right? The one thing I don't plate over is lead. I also don't plate over lead, so if I do any lead, if I need to do any repairs, I need to do that with brass, silicon bronze through brazing or TIG brazing, or even a really high-bearing silver solder, right? So those are some of the things. I will say that if you use a strike copper, if you do copper before you do nickel, you can plate over lead. It's not a problem to do that. But I don't have the copper situation, so I just don't use lead for repairs. Yeah?
Do you do cadmium?
I do not do cadmium. I actually have a zinc tank that is, if you don't use the brightener in it, it looks very close to cadmium. But I don't do cadmium. Cadmium is a tough thing to do. It has such repercussions environmentally. Yeah. But I will say, as far as cadmium plating goes, D-Tray here in Kansas City, they do a very good job of cadmium plating. A lot of places, you don't think so?
No. I've had Dutrade do it, but it comes out too shiny.
Oh,
And on the old bikes, you want it dull. And so I went to another place, in Gardner.
Oh, okay.
Did an excellent job.
uh-huh. Well, so this brings up a good point, Don. Dutrade's tank chemistry is probably just set up in a way where it makes a brighter looking cab than you're used to or that you want, right? So another good reason why you might do your own plating, but you know, aside from nickel plating, and then there's the whole chrome plating issue, right? So chromium came out in about the person who pioneered it in the mid-20s. So by 27, he'd applied for patents for it. So basically that's telling us that there's going to be no American-made motorcycle, probably pre-1929, that would ever have chrome on it. And same with cars. I think that like really high-end cars like Korns and Duesenberg and Packards, they were probably some of the first that started to use chrome. But like by, who knows the kind of years, by what, 31, 32, Harley was starting to use some chrome.
That sounds right.
Is that about right? So that jives with the time that the person applied for the patent. A few years of development make it feasible for like actual production, and by the 30s came around, we were off and running. We were chrome plating everything. What chrome plating is that it's basically a clear coat that is put on top of nickel. So without nickel, there's no chrome plating. And if you ever hear the term triple plating, it's that they did a strike copper, like you mentioned. They did nickel, and then they did a chrome on top of that. And they may have been polishing between each process. I know that when you put the strike copper on, copper is extremely malleable, very easy to polish. You can get it out to a near finish like very quickly. If you ever tried to polish stainless steel, which I hope you'll talk about next time, it's a pain to make it look good because it is so freaking hard to polish. So that might be a trick that show platers use, is they're polishing a substrate that's easier to polish than the parent metal. But chrome, is just as an example here, we're talking about this throwing power. Chrome has really, really bad throwing power. You need super high power in order to get the metal to go from the anode to the cathode. So I don't do chrome. I don't ever want to do chrome. The byproducts from doing chrome are extremely toxic, which is another reason why it's hard to find good chrome shops these days. This stuff is toxic. I mean, I'm dealing with muriatic acid and sulfuric acid. And so as I'm doing this, I'm wearing gloves the whole time. I don't get it on myself. I do it in a very well ventilated area. You know, there's all that safety stuff to go along with that. Yeah.
Did you already say what you use as a medium in that in the tank?
So okay, the electrolyte, where the solution is basically, I believe it is nickel ammonium sulfate. I believe that's what it is.
You can buy that in a
Yeah, so you know, I don't make that, I just buy it from this plating supply place, and I'm just gonna say this, I've never purchased it after I purchased it the first time. As water evaporates from it, when water evaporates, it doesn't take the material that's in the water with it. That material stays in the water. So all you do is you put a level line on your bucket, and every time you're done plating, you just fill it up with distilled water to keep it up to the level. I've had the same plating bath for 15 years.
So
Yeah.
how much money do you think you have involved in this whole
Okay,
thing?
so that's a great question, right? So when I first started this 15 years ago, I invested about $500 in this setup. And that was a lot cheaper than I probably could have had it plated for. Now, the amount of time and effort that you spend restoring nuts and bolts is astoundingly crazy, but, you know, it's part of the hobby. Nowadays, I bet you'd be at $1,000 for buying this stuff. Things has gone, the solutions have gone high, the anodes are extremely expensive, power supplies, it's all like twice as expensive as when I purchased the stuff. So, yeah, it's expensive. Yeah.
How often do you have to change the anode?
Yeah.
Because you use it up.
Well, so that's a great question. Let me take an anode out and I'll pass it around. This is what the anode,
What happens to the product also where the wire is hanging from it?
the wire gets plated.
And it plates underneath the wire too?
It usually is making such a small contact that you don't really see a problem. But yeah, it would potentially cause a thinner plate in that area. And you can mask things off. If let's say, here's a really great example. So this is the part of a throttle linkage on a 28 JD. So this had an oil controlled, this had an oiler that was controlled with the throttle. So when you hit the gas, it would open the butterfly on the carburetor, but then this little rod stuck through there, and then, so your throttle cable went in one side, and then out the other side goes to the oiler. Okay, great, that's all fine. This piece is brass. This is a stainless steel rod. Stainless steel is a pain because you got to put the whole sulfuric acid thing, right? Stainless looks very close to nickel. I'll pass this around. You can look at it. So I just took electrical tape and I masked off the rod and I just plated the clevis end, the rod end. So yeah, you can mask things off. Let's say you don't want threads inside something to be plated. You can use waxes. There's actually masking paints that are specifically for plating that are removable. You could use tape. So I use a lot of electrical tape for masking and things.
That withstands the heat of the,
Yes, and it's only about 120 degrees. So it does okay. It does get a little bit soft, but yeah. Yep. Okay, anodes. Yeah, so great question. This is what they look like before they turn into this, right? So how you do this is you cut this with tin snips, and then you, right? Do a little cut like this, fold this up. Now it makes a hook to go over your tank side, right? So that's what that looks like. I'll pass this around, and you can see right through it. This looks like Swiss cheese now. This will continue to plate as long as there is something there. And you can see it gets to a point, I can just pull the nickel right off of it right now. It's so thin. Right? So yeah, once these get really bad, you have to replace them. If you plate a whole lot, you have to replace them more. If you plate once a year, you hardly ever have to replace them. This is my second replacement. So I've gone through one set of anodes at this point. I have nickel plated an entire Indian motorcycle plus some other stuff out of one set of anodes. Not too bad.
You can buy them on eBay too.
Oh,
Easier.
yeah, and it just has to be pure nickel. It can't be some alloy that is like nickel mixed with something else. It has to be pure nickel. Okay?
where do you get it?
Well, he said eBay. He's found it on eBay.
Oh, yeah?
I know that this company, Caswell's, that sells all this plating stuff, they sell the anodes. That's where I got those particular ones. So then the other question is the takeaway from this is, do you want to do this or not? Like, weighing the options, right? Like, are you going to restore 3 1920s motorcycles? Maybe do this. Are you just needing to nickel plate 3 things? Probably don't do this. Right?
I don't know.
Pay the guy. Pay the plating place. Like if you need 4 things plated, just I don't know. That's my thing.
I
Yeah.
don't know, but
For those of us who don't know about the 1000s and 2000s and 3000s, let's say you took a bolt and a nut and you plated them both for an hour or whatever. Are they gonna screw?
So it depends on the standard of screw, right? So if Doug Rollert was here, he could explain like there's these different standards of fit on a screw, like how much clearance between the internal and the external threads. right? Okay, yeah, you named it, right?
3, 5, and 7 are the standards, yeah. And they're all have slightly different tolerances. Grade 7 is aircraft stuff, and if you played it, it ain't gonna fit.
Right.
Grade 5, I think you're probably okay. Grade 3 is standard hardware stuff, and yeah, it's sloppy enough to take 1,000s. But I don't take 3s.
Well, I will say that when I plated all the studs that hold my primary together on my Scout, and they're threaded on each end, and I plated the nuts as well. They would not screw on very well. So when I was done, I just took a 1/4x24 die, and I ran the die down the stud, and then I took a tap and I ran it through the nut. They worked fine after that. So yes, it can definitely mess up. And the finer the thread, like this would be one that would be a real pain. This to hold the valve pocket in, boy, you'd be screwed. If you got that filled up with, if you got this thing filled up with plate, it might not thread into there. So, you know, and like finding a tap for that, please, right? So, yeah, if you guys want to pass this thing around and look at it, yeah. But there's that box of screws that I handed around. You can try threading some of them on, and some of them are sticky. They don't work so great sometimes, yeah.
So on threading both, plastic thread.
Yeah.
So one gentleman burned aircraft. A lot of that's good plastic thread. So your interim clearance is smaller.
Right?
So if you were gonna plate, you definitely would want to stay with class 2. And so you're gonna move it on.
Or,
Standard
well,
threads and the class 1 is very difficult to find.
well, so there's a couple tricks here. So you could just mask the inside of the thread, or you could plate less time. So on threaded items, I've gotten to a point, instead of staying in the tank for an hour, something that's really fine threaded, I'll plate for 15 minutes. Now it does create a very thin plate. It's not very hard to get that plate off, but it doesn't interfere with those fine threads. So it's really that idea of like, the more I plate, the more material I'm adding. And if you have threads, just add less material, right? So you could plate for less time and still have some pretty good success, I think. So, what else did I bring? I don't know. So as far as polishing goes, you know, really, I'm really excited to hear about the polishing thing next time. Polishing is probably, it's probably 90% of the time you're going to spend doing this stuff. And it is just so time consuming, it's awful. It can be awful, I think. So, yeah.
You mentioned parkerizing earlier, and did I miss something? Because that's not part of this process at all.
No, but if somebody wants to take on parkerizing as a presentation, that'd be awesome. I mean, I do parkerizing, but a lot of the parkerizing stuff I've learned has been from members who are sitting in this room. Yeah. So, you know, if, I mean, I'd take it on if somebody wanted to talk about it, but if somebody else wanted to do it, it would be cool as well. But
2 months from now,
it is, I'm just going to say parkerizing is child's play compared to this.
Oh, yeah.
It is so much easier. There's no calculations. You just throw it in a bath and it comes out parkerized pretty much. It's very simple, you know, it's pretty easy. So, yeah, I mean, and this is stuff I parkerized. So this is a kicker pedal, 28 JD kicker pedal again. I bought this parkerized because the side plates and the interior piece is supposed to be nickel, but I didn't like the quality of nickel that you could buy that was nickel, so of course I bought parkerized and blasted the parkerizing off and then plated it to match my stuff. And then I didn't like their quality of parkerizing either, because the longer you leave it in or whatever, it looks different, right? I mean, you can make it look different. So I wanted all my parkerizing to match, so I reparkerized pedal axle. So anyway,
It can be anything from light gray to black.
right, and this is a pretty dark one. This is a pretty dark process, this particular one. So, you know, and just as these pedals had Parkerized studs, and I couldn't get the studs out of the rubber, so I actually I plated these pieces of rubber were hanging in my tank. So it didn't adversely affect the bath, and it didn't make the pedals look weird.
You didn't tape them?
I didn't tape them. I was like, well, how am I gonna, I just didn't tape them. I just was going to try it.
It's rubber.
And it seemed to work. It seemed to work fine. I don't know. So people are hand that around. That's what I came up with for the kicker pedal anyway.
Let's see, we got enough parts here for a JD and
Power Plus is coming up right here.
Tom,
Yeah.
one thing that needs to be mentioned, or maybe it doesn't, but when you take stuff to a plater, of course you want to take it clean, as clean as possible, but sometimes a handful of nuts, of bolts, is going to cost the same as a giant handful of nuts and bolts.
Oh, minimum.
You know, so a lot of times you want to take more than what you really need, and every little bit.
Well, so like, let's say you were going to plate a bunch of nuts and bolts. Let's say there's 30 studs and 60 nuts that you need to have for your project. Maybe you should have 35 studs and 75 nuts. There's a chance that plater's going to lose some of your washers. There might be some 101 studs hanging out in the bottom of a plating bath right now. Who knows, right? So don't count your chickens before they hatch if you're taking stuff to a platers. And I'm not picking on them. They're trying to make money in their production, right? They're not me in my shop with spectacles on going like this to every little part like I do. I mean, they don't care as much as I do. They're like, well, do you want to plate it or not, you know? So it's something to think about. Good point.
most platers have got a minimum award. Anyway, regardless of what you take to them, they're gonna charge you.
So you're saying that this could be $100 to plate?
It could be $300 for a boat.
I understand.
Hey, Tom,
Yeah.
do you want to mention anything about, by doing your own plating, if there's any trademarks or stampings that you're trying to preserve, that so often you can even tell the platers not to be careful, and they're not, but by doing it yourself,
Yeah.
you won't lose those.
Yeah, so like a really great example is this stamping on the top of this car body. It says DLX 45. And just to let you know, I spent like $1,200 to get that stupid little stamp, right? It matters, like to get the exact right carburetor on the exact right engine from the exact right year. And you take your rare carburetor to the plater and they polish or they just plate that stamping full.
You lose part of it.
Great question, right? So by being able to control how much plate you put on it, by being able to control what you polish or don't polish, you can preserve things like stampings, you can preserve texture, you can preserve making marks, you can preserve casting lines. So this carburetor is a great example of it. If this thing was polished out like a mirror, it would be pretty incorrect, right? This would have had this exact look in 1928, right? So if you're trying to achieve like a real particular look, if this got polished like this did up here, like that's incorrect. That's correct. Yeah.
What did they use to remove that?
Well, so that's a good question. A lot of times I'll have an old part that has nickel on it. Well, so for instance, I bought this carburetor from a guy in Wyoming. And it was a rebuilt carburetor. He redid all the seats in it. I mean, he did a beautiful job. But his plating, whoever did the plating job, it was pretty awful on the carb bowl. It was like really dark and gray. And maybe it was nickel, but it didn't match the rest of the carburetor. So I wanted the nickel gone from it. So I just took it in the sandblasting booth and I just blasted it off. No problems. However, if it was plated in a better way, where it had better adherence, man, it would be tough. So I probably, in that case, would have probably gotten sulfuric acid. I would have dipped the whole piece in sulfuric acid, neutralized it, and then plated over the old plate. So that's one way to get around it. There is a chemical stripping method. It's an aeronautical product. It's probably U.S. government. They probably came up with it in the 50s or something. It's probably U.S. government, like Navy, Army product or something. And there's a name for it. It's a nickel stripper. And I think that some plating places may be able to strip nickel. I don't know.
Just reverse the polarity.
I don't know about that. I'm not sure about reversing the polarity on that.
It works perfect.
On nickel plating?
Yep, and you get the nickel back and you don't have to pay for it.
And so then the question would be, what now? So in that point, you are basically reversing the process. The part is now the anode,
Yes.
and then the plate that is hanging down is now the cathode.
Yes.
So now you're getting nickel from this and plating something else. So what would be I've never done this. What would be the metal that hangs in there? Piece of steel, piece of brass, copper?
Another piece of nickel. That's your original anode. You just plate to it.
I've never done this.
What's to keep the brass also from the carburetor body
Because-
also going over to
Because the electrolyte is made for nickel, and it has a salt in it that's compatible with nickel. And so it will break copper brass. Electrolyte, it's like a mini plate.
When you get to the brass, it stops. I worked in a plating shop for 2 years,
Oh yeah?
courtesy of the United States government.
Did I do an okay job talking about this?
Well, you're doing just fine. We were plating parts as big as you are.
Yeah, right. Huh.
There were missile parts.
Well,
And
so,
bomb components.
I got something to say about the texture again.
yeah.
We plated an intake manifold of mine, and I brought it and I put it next to my head, and it was so bright, it was just standing out. I'm like, I can't have this. So I just tried it. I put it in my walnut blaster, and I lightly walnut blasted it, and it dulled it down a little bit. I stuck it next to the heads, and it looked pretty good.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to think that Harley or Indian or any of those companies would have worried about having their plating match. I mean, it's like, we're overdoing it. All of this is over restoration. It is all completely way overboard. But I don't know. I like going overboard. Anyway, any other questions? I like the questions. I like the comments because it's about learning this stuff. This isn't just about me saying, I know everything. I don't know everything. Did you have something to say?
Can you play it over J.D. Weld?
So, that's an interesting point. So, like, there are electrically conductive paints that get put on things that can be plated over. I don't know anything about that. I've not done that.
Like plastics.
Like plastics. Yeah.
Plastic.
Yeah. Did you have a comment?
I just wanted to say, when you're talking with your plater, remember that he's gonna charge you more for hung items, cooked items, rather than basket items. But you really don't wanna get that glob back that was a pile of nuts and bolts that he put in the basket. I'll try to remember to bring.
Oh, you have a bunch of plated together.
Yeah, they're plated together, they're worthless now.
Yeah.
They're in a bag to remind me where not to take them anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, the effort of actually cutting a wire and wiring up a part, it's extra labor. That's basically what you're talking about, right? Like, if you just take a basket and throw it in there, it's like,
You have a new anode.
yeah, you have a new anode. There you go. Yeah.
If you're doing a bunch of nuts and washers, can you just take that wire and make it to where you just line them up on that
Okay,
wire like that?
so yeah, about wiring parts. Let's say I did this with, you're gonna laugh at me. I plated all my cotter pins, which in the end probably, I'll explain why that was stupid. But here's how I did it. I took my wire and I went like, I basically did this. And I did it with needle nose pliers, so it was really small.
So they look like icicles on a Christmas tree.
Yep. So I basically make the wire like this, right? Now it can hang down into the tank. And I would move it like this, so now it's going in this orientation in the tank, so now I can hang other parts here. If I make it so it's in this orientation, it takes up a lot of space, right? So move it like this. I mean, there were times I had 20, 30 cotter pins hanging from a wire, right? So now why is it bad that a cotter pin was plated?
It breaks.
What breaks, number one, or if it doesn't break, because you are twisting that steel pin all the way around, the plating just crackles and crinkles off. So all of my, probably did 50 or 60 cotter pins, like, oh, I'm just gonna do a whole bunch of them. It was waste. I got it, I went to McMaster-Carr and just bought all the right size and stainless. And they look exactly like a nickel-plated cotter pin. Just lesson learned there, right? One of those things you just do. So. But yeah, definitely. You could get a whole bunch of nuts and bolts. I mean, you could plate 30, 40, 50 parts on one small tank bar if they're little pieces, and you get creative with the way you wire your parts up, for sure. Yep. Which just goes back to the gunsmith. I can't imagine plating one nut at a time. That's what he did. I just do one at a time. I'm like, okay. Anyway. Any other questions or comments?
Can you plate over tin?
I imagine that you could. I can't say I've ever done that. I imagine you could. I don't know the answer for that.
So we've got a gas tank that I'm building. That Roach motorcycle I had up there. That's a solid gas tank, so I'm rebuilding that. And I'm thinking this would be really cool if it was nickel plated. But I don't know if you
You think that
well, because you're tinning the surface to, actually putting tin on the surface.
Oh, yeah. Well, so if you solder it together, the term tinning is actually like, it's a little bit of a misnomer.
Yeah.
Because when I tin gas tanks, it's a mixture of 50-50 tin and lead.
Yeah, okay.
So I imagine you could definitely plate over that. You would have to do that striped copper thing that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, you'd have to plate over it with something for that.
We're gonna finish up here, Tom. You can have a session if somebody needs to ask Tom some more questions. He'll be here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, great job.
Good job.
Anyway, thank you, everybody.
I got directories over here. If anybody wants a directory, and let me know if you want a shirt for no more.
I motion that we close.
They sell all kinds of different stuff.
Just gonna go down and just videotape all the buckets.
Also, you said something about the year of the Power Plus.
Yeah.
The Power Plus is really the bike that had the leaf spring rear end, and that they built them to 1924.
That's right. There was a standard Scout, right?
Yeah, they changed. No, it wasn't a Scout. It was 61. 61 cubic inch, but they did have.